But some of the causes, like for one major one in the Indigenous people is residential school system. You know, the 60 scoop, day schools, all of that. That's a main concern and cause of alcoholism, drugs, and suicide rates in Indigenous people and youth.
Tansi, hello everybody. Sean McDonald, Métis Man here. Welcome to my YouTube channel.
I was born a Métis, born on Métis land, raised on a settlement, proud to be a Métis man. Well, today I work in white man's world. I'm married to a Métis girl.
Tansi and good day, everybody. Sean McDonald, Métis Man here. And today I'm joining you from Edmonton, Alberta, the capital here in Alberta. And it's a very cold day. It's like minus 32 right now with very strong winds. It's supposed to be even colder tonight. But I want to speak to you again on a subject that I had brought up quite a few videos ago, probably about half a year ago, on suicide. And back then I was talking mainly about men's mental health and stuff like that. And suicide being a part of that. And there has been more change since I released that episode with the stats on suicide and that. And I did get some feedback from some Indigenous youth on suicide and that. So I'm hoping that, well, I know the video did help some youth, and as long as it helps one person, then I'm definitely good with that. But going back before that video, I did lose a nephew to overdose. And then about 3 days after releasing that video, I lost a niece to suicide. And both, of course, were Indigenous. So, and just a few days ago, we buried a friend's child to suicide. So it's a very touchy, taboo subject, Indigenous or not. But why is it taboo? I don't figure that out. People don't want to talk about it. They don't want to bring it to light. And to me, if you don't deal with the problem, or any problem, if you don't deal with it and talk about it, it's only going to get worse. And that's what we have found over the years in our Indigenous communities. It's just at all-time highs across the nation. And to me, alcoholism and drugs and all that, drug addictions, overdose, that's all a form of suicide. To me, you know you're taking a high amount of drugs and you know there's a risk or a chance of dying from that, then you know there's a good chance that you might not see the next day, the next morning, or whatever it is. So you're willingly taking that amount, whatever that is, or over drinking or whatever, excessively taking drugs or alcohol, to me is a form of suicide. But after being at so many funerals in the past year, the past even few years, and the majority of them being youth from suicide or drug overdoses or alcoholism, it's just time to bring this subject once again to light. So it's time to bring it to light and talk about it more, because we don't have enough of that. Enough of people talking about it. The suicide rate is 6 times higher with the First Nations and Métis youth. And even higher yet is 11% with the Inuit youth. And that's compared to the non-Indigenous people in Canada. So a lot higher, so you can just do the math. And then to throw it into more perspective, Indigenous people only make up 4% of Canada's overall population. But yet we're 6 to 11 times higher with the suicide rates. So that really makes you think. So you kind of think about it and you say, well, why is it higher? How could race, play a role in that? And going to funerals and interviewing elders and just meeting them wherever for a coffee and that, I would bring up the suicide rates and stuff like that. And they put their heads down and you can just see the pain in their eyes. And they talk about they'd never seen it like this ever. Like even me, I'm early 50s right now, and growing up, was there suicide? Well, yeah, there was suicide, but not like it is now. The drugs weren't rampant like it was now. Alcoholism was there, I don't think that's changed much. That's always been there, but the drugs are more easily accessible now than what they were back when I was a youth. And not to mention there's so many new types, much more dangerous types of drugs, like pint and all of this stuff. And, there's so many out there I don't even know. I don't keep up on that. Although I do talk about it with my sons, my children. I just don't know the names of all the drugs, but I know they're out there. Fentanyl and all of that stuff. But going back to the elders, they said it just hurts them to see us burying our youth at such a high rate. And there's no parent, and there should be no grandparent that should be burying their kids or grandkids and seeing that. That's just not the way it works. We should be burying our parents or grandparents before ourselves and our children is how it should be, right? But that's not the case. It's just an unheard of rate, like the elders have not seen. And they're highly concerned, of course, and they want to see something done. But they can see how the world has changed, in my time even, let alone their times of the grandparents and stuff, how much has changed over the years. The causes are still there. That is what has made suicide rate higher, Indigenous people, Indigenous youth, and it's people in general too. It's not just the youth. But some of the causes, like for one major one in the Indigenous people is residential school system. The 60 scoop, day schools, all of that's a main concern and cause of alcoholism, drugs, and suicide rates in Indigenous people and youth is that. But ones that don't understand when I say that, they say, how could that be? The youth, I shouldn't put it myself, I'm not young anymore, but the youth, they're not going through the residential school system. How could they be affected? Well, let me tell you why and how they're being affected. Is, my musher, my grandpa was in the residential school system. And I said on previous videos, he was young, he was beaten. He spent many years in there, he was beaten. He'd run away, they'd catch him, they'd bring him back, beaten again, and beat the fucking shit right out of him, and thank the Creator he survived, or else I would not be here myself, or my parents were. The whole family would not be here right now. But, as I said, even though he was in that, he still went, to serve his country in World War I and fought in the war. But anyway, I hear stories talking to people that knew him and that, and to family members. It really, really changed him. He was a changed man, and with every right to be changed after being treated like that, and disrespected, and in whatever atrocities that happened behind the closed doors, where many of our children went missing and died, right? That's a whole new subject, another subject by itself, with the children that are found at these residential schools. It's a whole different subject. But anyway, what I'm getting back to, like Baby Mushroom and people that were attending these schools that survived, they come back changed. If they did come back, they definitely did not love themselves. They didn't. A lot of them were taken away at very young, so they never knew what love was. And so if you never knew what love was, and you come back and you start raising a family, how can you teach something that you don't know? Like love and respect and compassion and caring and taking care of somebody, if you weren't taught that because you were raised by this government and church and the RCMP, it was their system that was in place. If you're raised by that system, how can you teach it if you never were taught it? And even if they were older and thrown into that school, well, it was taken from you. You were beaten, you were chastised into not talking, your language, cut off all their long, beautiful hair, delice them and treat them like filthy fucking animals. And so if you're grown up like that and raised like that, and not even raised is a bad term, because they weren't raised, they were treated like beneath animals. They treat their horses and their cows and their pigs better than what they treated the Indigenous, children back then. So you hear stories like that of how people are treated in the system, and it affects the generation after that. So that generation, which would be my dad's era, my dad's generation, they were not loved. They were taught to keep their mouth shut about their culture, their language, their way of life that they grew up. I used to be so fucking mad at my dad not teaching me and my siblings Cree. I didn't hate him for it, but darn near, like, why not? He taught me other ways of the culture, or our culture, but the language not so much, a little bit towards the end. But growing up, there was hardly a word spoken unless he was talking to his siblings or elders or something like that in front of us. But at home, no. And so, of course, he wasn't taught that. And he was taught, and that generation were taught next to no love, next to no compassion. Right? So you can't just break out of that cycle in one generation. And my generation is the second generation. And then my kids and the kids nowadays is the third generation. And some are second generation that were in the residential school systems. So how do people expect, non-Indigenous people expect us to be hunky-dory and all full of smiles and love, like how they expect us to be after going through that, I really do think it's going to take 7 generations or more to get that. I don't know, it'll never be forgotten. I'll do my part to make sure it's never forgotten. But to make us feel better about ourselves as a people, we were almost eradicated off of the face of the map. And we were made to feel like shit, our ancestors. So, and I admit, like even growing up, yeah, I look white for the most part, and I am part white, but I don't know that life. I don't know that way of life. I was not raised that way at all. I was born and raised, like I say, in Kiikinimati settlement, and I do not know the white man's life, being, I'm 54 years old now. I don't know that way of life. I wasn't raised that way. Yes, my mom was white, but she took on the native way of life as well. She fit right in there and she learned our ways and that. And so even growing up, I was chastised as soon as the people around me knew that I was white. I mean, I was a white looking kid that was actually native. I was thrust into that category of being a filthy native and that, and looked down upon and frowned upon. And that hurt growing up, myself. And you try to bring and raise your kids up differently as well to be proud. But what I'm getting at is you just can't get rid of it in 1 or 2 generations. And like any human person, any person alive, how do you deal with pain like that? Your emotions are running wild and stuff like that. How do you deal with it? Well, the majority, including myself, I had turned to alcoholism, drugs, stuff like that. And you don't. That old adage of saying, how can you love somebody if you don't love yourself? Well, that's so true for many of us, many of us. And you teach that. You don't teach it intentionally, but it's passed down to your kids. And just subtly, not as bad as the generation before, right? So every generation, I hope and pray, it subtly is dissipating. So it'll be not out of our memories, but out of our way of life, and that to make us a proud peoples once again. Before the colonizers came to Turtle Island, to America, North America, our ancestors were very proud people. But that was all beaten out of them and forbidden. And then they turned exactly opposite of being proud. Being very not so proud, or not proud at all of ourselves and our way of life, and that it made them believe that it was almost evil. Well, in their eyes, it was evil. If you talked about your traditional way of life, your traditional beliefs, it still isn't that way. And a lot of the religions say, well, if you practice or believe in our traditional ways of life, then you're going to hell. So that means every fucking indigenous person before my time and before the white people come and settled, the Europeans come and settled, that they're all going to hell because they didn't believe in Jesus Christ or their God, because they believed in the traditional ways of the Creator and all that, and the land as being our Mother Earth and stuff like that. That don't sit well with me, It doesn't sit well at all. So it's stuff like that are still bred into us. So going back to suicide and the overdoses and that, there's the main reason why the suicide rate is so high among our Indigenous youth, because it's not even near getting out of our system, our hearts, our souls, our minds of what happened to our people in the past. It's only been, like, for crying out loud, like, I think the last residential school shut down in 1996, right? So that's 30, 31 years. That's nothing, So to beat fresh out of our system is not going to happen, like I say, in a couple of generations. So you think of how people are raised, like especially nowadays, how most youths are raised. They're thrown a screen onto their lap, and that's their babysitter, and that's what teaches them. That's how they learn majority of the stuff, besides what they learn in school and what little face-to-face or human touch they get from home, at home. And that's not only Indigenous people, that's everybody. Because you see kids all over the place, 2 years old with a fucking screen in their hands, and that's the babysitter. You know, throw them a screen and they shut up, and that's not healthy for any child growing up, no matter what race. But what are they learning? Then they get on to, they start off playing games or whatever it is on those devices, and then they log on to the internet, and that's when the trouble starts again. They're not. I tell my boys, my kids, when they're being raised, I said, what you hold in your hand, but they weren't allowed phones until they were, 15, 16 years old at least, if not older than that. They weren't allowed that. They weren't even allowed video games. That might sound harsh to a lot of you, but I don't care what you think. That's how I raised my kids. They were outside, they were playing, they were working, they were into sports, all of that stuff. But anyway, the stuff that these youth are learning on these fucking devices. Like I told my boys, I said, you have the power of your hand, the power in your hand that is so unmatched, unreal. Like, we grew up with encyclopedias and word of mouth and reading books. That's how we learned. I said, but now, I said, you can learn any goddamn thing you want by picking up your little computer, your little phone, typing it or speaking into it now, and you instantly learn, but that can be a very good tool, but it can be exact opposite contrast of that, and a very, very bad tool. Because, you see almost all the kids, they're not sitting on there learning stuff off the internet. They're watching stupid videos, they're chatting, they're sending, pictures of themselves that they shouldn't be sending over, anybody shouldn't be getting. And it's not a good tool, especially not for a youth. So that's another system in place that's against the Indigenous youth and all youth. It's dumbing us down. Like, I never seen the humanity getting so dumb than what I see it nowadays. But yeah, it can be good. Like, I'm hoping my channel that is serving here for people is good to watch on these screens, but there's so much bad out there and on the internet and on these devices. But getting back to the causes of suicide, well, that's another one right there, is the devices and the internet. It's a wicked, wonderful tool, but on one extreme it's this, and on the other extreme it's that, exact contrast. And, we lost as a people, especially young ones, like, discrimination and racism's alive and well, and it's even more there than what I've seen and known when I was a youth. It got better there for a while, but it's coming back again. And even the governments that are in place, and I don't pick and choose when it comes to governments anymore. I put them all in the same group now. They're all in it for themselves and stuff like that. So when you vote, you got to pick the lesser of the 3 or 4 evils that you have to choose from. But anyway, the racism, it's with government and that, and organizations, they have to control us, and in order to do that, they must divide us. Because as a whole, as one, we are so strong, they cannot control us. So the old adage again of divide and conquer, it's so true, right? And that's what's happening with what I see in the world. And that's what's causing the racism to come back, right? They don't want to lose control of all the populations and that, so they divide us, they conquer us, and they pit us against each other, whites against blacks, everybody against the natives and stuff like that, the Mexicans, the Pakistanis, all of that stuff, right? We all bleed red as far as I know. And we all have hearts and souls and feelings. So we're not any different. You cut us open and look inside, it's the same damn thing, right? And people got to realize that. But as far as racism, it is worse, right? And with that, we've lost our, and especially with the youth, they have no sense of belonging, right? It's a loss of our culture, loss of our language, a sense of belonging. Everybody wants to belong to somebody or something, a group, a community, whatever it is. And when our Indigenous people are lost for the most part, and it's hard to have that sense of belonging. You want to belong to your friends, and then if your friends happen to be bad and on drugs, well, you belong. You're part of a family, but that's the wrong family to be choosing. But then if you have not much of a family at home, and your parents are drinking or drugging or whatever, well, then it's monkey see, monkey do, right? And then the cycle just continues and continues and continues, generation after generation. So we must learn to break that cycle, And, some of the ways that we can break that cycle is, to talk to our youth. Going back to the last funeral that I attended, there was an elder there, and she was singing some songs. And she had asked the parents of this child that took their life, she asked the parents beforehand and got their approval if she could read a poem that she wrote years ago, because this elder that was singing actually battled depression and suicide when she was a youth. And she almost threw the towel and took her own life. But she turned to God back then, and still is now. And she wrote a poem about it, and she read this poem aloud, talking about suicide and dealing with trauma instead of hiding it and stuff like that. It's a beautiful poem. I hope one day to maybe have a little video of her reciting that poem. But everybody, had their heads down listening to this poem. And I thought to myself, that's one of the major problems we have nowadays is not talking about the problem we have about suicide and overdose and alcoholism with our youth and our people in general. Is not talking about it, no matter what race it is. So that's what we got to do, to starters too, is to not make the subject taboo anymore. Talk about it. Talk to your kids, and love them, and take them out to the bush. Teach them our Indigenous ways. And I talk about the word Indigenous, but that's another subject as well too. I like saying Native or Aboriginal or whatever it is. But anyway, show them our traditional ways. Teach them that. And if you don't know how, then find somebody that can or will. Take them fishing. Take them camping. Get them lessons on talking our traditional languages. Because our languages are almost all dead and gone. It is, because that's what the European settlers want, and it's damn near there, And you can say, well, that was, hundreds of years ago or whatever, but yeah, it was, but it's going to take generations to fix that if we can save them at all. And if we don't, well, then we lose our culture with the language as well. It's hand in hand, So teach them our language. And going back to the internet, if your kids are young and you're going to give them devices at a young age, screen them. Screen what they're seeing on the internet. Limit their time that they're on these devices that are dumbing us down. And by all means, don't use it as a weapon. Don't use anything as a weapon against kids, because they're going to use it against you and turn it around as they get older, right? So don't do that, but limit their time. It's a very good educational tool, don't get me wrong, but in the wrong hands or used the wrong way, it's fucking evil. It is evil. So limit their times with the devices. Grief counseling on our settlements and reserves, our communities. Grief counseling is good. I hear some communities that have that. Grieving the loss of a loved one, especially to suicide and alcoholism, overdose, drugs and stuff. But we got to step in before the loss of a loved one, before we need grief counseling. And that's to try to save their lives, right? And you do that by reaching out, try to get them off drugs, get them into rehabilitation and stuff like that, and have a prevention with them, and talk about it. No more being fucking taboo. Bring it to the light. Bring it to the light and talk about it. Hug them, love them. Talk about what can happen. And so many of them are leaving their young children behind. Well, that's just gonna keep on going. It cycles, right? Generation after generation. So we got to break the chain now, break the cycle now. At least starting to. It's not going to happen overnight. It's definitely not going to happen in one generation, but we can make a damn big dent in it anyway. And most importantly, what we all need is to be proud again. Proud of who we are, what we are, and where we're from, and our ancestors and our traditional ways and our languages. Be proud of that. And by that, learn it, showcase it, strut it around. We must take that back. We're, just talk about land back and all that. Well, let's take back our culture, our way of living, our way of life. Let's take that back. That was robbed from us. Robbed from our ancestors, robbed from our people. Let's bring that back with a vengeance. And then we can go from there. I want to see our youth leading this country. I applaud, the MLAs, MPs that are Indigenous and that. I really do. But I really want to see an Indigenous prime minister or president down south running these countries or helping to run. If you think that the president or prime minister actually runs the countries, then you don't know politics too well. Be proud. Love one another. Somebody's having a bad day or whatever it is, give them a hug, talk to them. Stop whatever you're doing because you could be saving somebody's life. And that somebody could be your own child. Keep an eye out. There's always little subtle hints of what's going on, especially if somebody's quiet. And they're not normally quiet. There's something up. And just learn that, right? And community leaders, this is to you. Get rid of the fucking dealers. Kick them off the settlements, off the reserves, off the communities, put them in fucking jail, whatever it is. Get rid of the cocksuckers. Those are the ones that are fueling the situation. And even the ones that are off reserve and settlements, can point fingers all you want, but if you're a fucking drug dealer, you're the ones that are help fueling this fire. So get them sons of bitches in jail or whatever it takes to get them to stop dealing in that. And of course, the war on drugs, well, that's ongoing. And, you buy drugs or you sell drugs, then you're just as good as the one putting the rope around their neck or pulling the trigger to the gun to their head or them overdosing. You're just as guilty, in my mind. And that's how it should be by law. Somebody overdoses on drugs, they should be trying to find that fucking dealer and put them in jail too. But yes, so that's been all heavy in my mind since the last funeral I attended. And it just seems like every week, if not every second week for sure, you hear about the surrounding, Native communities around my area, especially, of losing another youth suicide or overdose or alcoholism. And it's not good. We're losing them such a high rate. So, and with that, in the future, we're going to be losing a lot of our population, which is only 4% of Canada right now. If this keeps up, then where are we going to be in another 10, 20 years? 2% of the population? I don't know. So something must be done. So, it starts with you at home. And then it goes to our community leaders, governments, and all of that. Everybody must step up to put an end to this. So again, not to bring you down, whatever, but it's got to be brought to light. So please talk about it. And again, if you're one of those youth or people that are thinking about suicide and all that, reach out to somebody. Every reserve and settlement in the community has a hotline or a place or a person you can talk to. And I've always said you can message me directly and I'll phone you. And I have talked to people the last time I said that. So do that, and I will put a couple of phone numbers in the description below on this YouTube channel on this episode of where you can phone and that. But like I said, every community, Indigenous community, has their own helpline or a person that'll help you out as well. If you cannot talk to a family member or whatever, but be proud of who you are and what we are as a people and who you are. You are definitely loved by somebody. And yeah, that's all I wanted to talk about. So not to bring you down with this episode, but some stuff needs to be talked about. And this is definitely priority on my list. The residential school system and the negative impacts it's had on our people since then, generation after generation. And we're falling just like fucking dominoes. So let's fix it. It's not going to happen overnight, but let's fix it. All right. So thank you all for joining again for this episode. And we'll catch you in the next one. Stay warm. You are loved by somebody. I love you. And I want to thank you for supporting me and watching these videos and sharing them, subscribing, stuff like that. So, kinast gomtin, hawaw, hi, eximaga, matey man out.
Thanks everybody for watching. Kinast Gomtin. Please like, share, and subscribe. Eximaga.